wonderful way to close out the seminar series. David Miller is an attorney by training, born, I believe, in San Francisco, is that correct?
Yes.
Who has devoted virtually all of his career to public service. He served as mayor of Toronto in 2 terms, from 2003 to 2010. No, not that mayor. And was, I think, among the many aspects of his years in office that were notable is that he dedicated himself very much to the development of programs and policies to make sure that Toronto remained, as it is, a very enticing, livable city, and indeed creating sustainable, livable cities has really been a driving interest of David's for many years. And I also note that he served as mayor in those 2 terms largely without any formal party affiliation, disdaining any forced ties or bonds that might be associated with you into a particular party's ideology. He was also chair of the C-PREE Cities Climate Leadership Group from 2008 to 2010, and that is a network currently numbering 83 of the world's megacities that are committed to taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's an international network of leaders of the world's great cities. Since September of 2013, David Miller has been the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund of Canada, one of that nation's largest and most influential NGOs. It is a real pleasure to welcome him here to Princeton today to talk about While Nations Talk, Cities Act. Ladies and gentlemen, David Miller.
Thanks very much, David, for that gracious and warm introduction. As you mentioned, my successor, I do have to say in Toronto we're quite experienced with politicians who are run on populist platforms and say whatever seems to come into their head. And although we're not here today to discuss U.S. politics, I've seen it happen before, so you should all be very worried. Without referring to any particular political candidate, of course. I also I want to acknowledge David's originally from Buffalo, and Buffalo and Toronto have a very long-standing relationship. So it's they get all the snow. It hits Buffalo. They get a foot of snow, and we get none. It's really, thank you.
You get all the culture.
Yes, we do get all the culture. And I'm very lucky. My background, I was born in San Francisco, but my mom left a year and a half later, went back to England, and we lived in a tiny little farming village outside Cambridge, and came to Canada in 1967, which was a very big year in Canada. It was the centennial. And to go from living in a tiny farming village with a population of about 50 people, behind us was the dairy, across the street was the egg farm, and down the street was the beet farm. Of course, being England, there were 2 pubs. Just in case you had disagreement, you went to the other pub. And the church basically ran everything in the village. Going from there to be the mayor of Canada's largest and most successful economically and culturally city has been a wonderful journey. And sometimes when I was in office, I'd wake up and sort of wonder how on earth I got there. It's nothing to do with my presentation today, but it's meeting somebody from Buffalo that makes me ramble. So what I wanted to talk about, I'm going to try to take 35 minutes or so there's some time for questions, but I'm still a recovering politician, so don't keep me to any time limits, please. My perspective gained from 16 years of municipal office, 7 as mayor, 2 as the chair of the C-PREE, and then 5 years since, 3 of which I spent at the World Wildlife Fund, about how cities across the world are acting to fight climate change while nations continue to talk. And my perspective's been enriched by my time at World Wildlife Fund Canada. But a lot of what I'm saying today is about the C40 group of cities that David mentioned, and about Toronto as being a case study of what cities are actually doing to make real change. Of course, it's extremely serious. I don't need to tell a distinguished room like this about climate change, but you may not know about World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. Came out 2 years ago. Comes every 2 years. There'll be another one this fall. It showed since the 1970s, so since David and I were in college, which feels very recent, 52% of the world's populations of wildlife have disappeared. So in the last 40 years or so, not species, actual populations. And this is measured by a number of scientific studies led through England. It's quite remarkable. I saw the puzzled brows that people not believing this might be true, perhaps. We stand by the science, and it's because of human activity, deforestation, particularly impact on freshwater. A lot of these species are freshwater species. And more, we are seeing the impact on wildlife because of climate change. We're seeing that in the oceans. In Canada in particular, we're seeing it in the Arctic. Polar bears today face an existential threat. The sea ice season is diminishing. And the polar bears feed off the edge of the sea ice. They feed on seals. And as the season diminishes, their ability to feed diminishes. And what that means is we're starting to show signs now. We do a lot of monitoring and work with the polar bear. We're starting to see signs that the mothers aren't well enough fed to properly nurture their cubs. So they're okay right now, but they face a really significant threat from climate change because of the diminishing sea ice season. Interestingly, so do the Inuit. Because the Inuit live essentially off the edge of the sea ice as well, because that's where they hunt and fish. They hunt the seals and fish there. So people and nature are facing a really significant challenge. So what we're seeing from a World Wildlife Fund perspective is very serious threats to wildlife populations around the world from a variety of human activities, more and more from climate change. So for us, Paris last December was extremely important. I was there. It was an amazing moment. I'd also been in Copenhagen in 2009 on behalf of the C40. We had a cities summit talking about all the actions cities were doing to fight climate change, and then the parallel national government summit just down the street failed to reach agreement. And people thought they actually were going to reach agreement. It was incredibly depressing. What the cities were doing was exciting, but Copenhagen itself was very depressing, particularly to be a Canadian, because our government was one of the governments that actively intervened to try to stop reaching agreement at the time. So Paris became very important to everybody who is involved in this issue. And of course, because of the terrible terrorist tragedies a couple of weeks before the summit, it became very emotionally important as well for Paris to succeed. And the mayor of Paris, I have to say, was magnificent throughout the week. So were the French government. This was a poster that was up on bus stations, bus stops, and all around Paris at the time from WWF France. And I just have to say, just by way of background, if you don't know it, World Wildlife Fund is probably the world's largest conservation organization. We're in well over 100 countries. The way we work, we're essentially a network. And you sign an agreement to adhere to certain principles, but the one thing that you're not allowed to fiddle with is the logo. And you can see the logo down here. It's one of the world's most recognizable logos. About 5 years ago, somebody did a survey, and it was as recognized as McDonald's and Apple. So it's really important. So you're not allowed to change the logo at all, unless you're French. So France here, this is, do people know this painting that it's referencing? Liberty? Yeah. So the painting, the idea of the painting was Liberty, who's a woman, is coming across, and all the people of France are behind her from all different classes. And she's coming across, it's a symbolic of democracy, starting the French invented democracy from their perspective. And this painting is symbolic of that invention. So it's a very powerful image for WWF France to use the panda in this completely inappropriate way, but because they're French, nobody told them not to. And was, I think, indicative of the feeling coming before the Paris conference. The people of the world from all different backgrounds were coming together, and the nations had to agree. Fortunately, of course, they did. Ban Ki-moon and President Hollande and some others in this photograph. Extremely important agreement. And I think we should be proud of it. There are, of course, some flaws. The first flaw is that the agreement is basically a set of country actions that they've offered to take, which, when added up, don't do enough to keep climate change within reasonable limits, certainly not within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. They're aspirational. Secondly, it doesn't really come into force for 5 years. So that's a problem. It's a fantastic moment, though. And to be there during this negotiation, I have to give credit to the French, because they left absolutely no stone unturned to reach agreement. And one of the things they paid attention to, which I thought was very interesting, was the experience of the delegates. So, for example, there was very heavy security, as you can imagine, because of terrorist attacks. But they did it in a way that there were no lines. So, you know, unlike LaGuardia Airport, where you're always lining up to get through security, they had about 75 of those X-ray machines, so that the thousands of people coming through could get through without any lines. So that was very smart. They had incredible food, really good French food, and they had the best coffee I've ever had in my life on these little red coffee trucks that sort of drove into the conference floor. And by the way, I want to bring them to North America. It's my idea. You're not allowed to, but go Google them. It was really fascinating, and I commented on the coffee to somebody, and they said, this is on purpose. The French actually sat down and said, how do we put people in the best possible spirit to reach an agreement? And one of the things they needed to do was make sure the delegates were happy. Now, they had to do some other things as well, the normal tools of this diplomacy, like threats and bribery and intimidation and other sort of diplomatic niceties. But they also, they left no stone unturned. So I think you really have to give credit to France for reaching that agreement. So this is the perspective of the world on greenhouse gas emissions. We know more or less where they're from. And from my perspective, as somebody heavily involved in cities and involved in an environmental not-for-profit, I'm actually optimistic about what is possible. And I'm optimistic because of the real actions of cities. Paris is a moment that hopefully will inspire national governments to take the right policy strategies and the right practical steps. But we know from the work that's being done in cities that it is extremely possible to address climate change in a way that benefits jobs and creates prosperity and also makes better places to live for people. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And my perspective is, if you look at each of these areas, there are significant things that can be done today with known available technology in economically efficient ways that significantly reduce emissions. Electricity and heat production. We know about that from the future dean of the Faculty of Engineering here. Significant opportunities in electricity and heat production. In Europe, for example, district energy is common. Far less energy used to heat and cool a house when you have district energy. It's simple. That's not complicated. It's actually less expensive to do it in most scenarios. Agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Agriculture is a challenge, but forestry is about deforestation. There are a lot of organizations like WWF working on those issues. Buildings, how we heat and cool buildings, I'll come back to in a minute, very significant. Transportation, industry, lots of sectors are working on emissions in their own area. So this is how people traditionally look at global emissions by economic sector. But there's another way to look at emissions, and that is about the emissions by place. And C-PREE has done a study, and it shows that, depending on how you allocate them, somewhere between 70 and 75% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world come from cities and the activities required to sustain them. And the good news about that is the sources of those emissions are really clear. They're about electricity and heat production, buildings, and transportation. Those are the majority of emissions in the cities. And we know from the work of the C-40 cities and others that there are significant things that city governments can do, sometimes in partnerships with other governments, on all three of those areas. So we can make massive strides to lower greenhouse gases from the 70 to 75% that are in cities if we deal with how we generate electricity, how we heat and cool buildings, and how we transport ourselves around those cities. And the good news from my perspective is cities are already taking that leadership. And the C-40 organization is an organization of mayors. And that matters because when you're an organization of mayors, you're actually the implementer. David mentioned that in Toronto we don't have party politics, and I was essentially an independent. There were 44 members of council, and some days it was like having 44 political parties. And that was only in the morning. In the afternoon, it was like having 44 other political parties. But one of the things about the role of the mayor in a system like that, it's called the weak mayor system, is that if the mayor has an agenda, that really sets the agenda for that government. Because some will disagree with it and fight it. Most will come along and help craft it. So the role of the mayor is extremely important. And that's partly why cities have been effective on climate change, but there's another reason as well. Because cities already are seeing the impact of climate change. And it has a huge financial impact on city governments. So a smart mayor who is already having to spend significant money on adapting to climate change is going to want to intervene in the international debate in ways that help mitigate against climate change. The reason I have this storm here, the storm happened in Toronto in 2009. But it's an example of 3 that happened in my last 4 years as mayor that were all 50-year storms. So storms that were supposed to happen once every 50 years were happening virtually annually. And each one had hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. This is a built-up, modern, highly economically successful city. Toronto's the home to 5 of 6 of Canada's major banks. It's the home to head offices of all the insurance companies, most of the big law firms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's still an important manufacturing hub. The heart of the Canadian auto industry is all around Toronto. It's a really modern, successful city, and even in that city, the impact on the infrastructure was enormous. Roads washed out, bridges, damage to people's houses. And it's because the infrastructure is built to handle a 50 or 100-year storm every 50 or 100 years. And so in Toronto's case, on one program to help address these floods, not very well named the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan. There will be a test afterwards. I wish it was like Sewer Toronto or something. But the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan was going to cost the City of Toronto $1 billion. And when I was mayor, we collected 3.3 billion Canadian dollars in tax revenue. So it's a third of our tax revenues. Hugely important. And cities are seeing this around the world. Jakarta, for example, in Indonesia, very active member of the C-40. Huge flooding problems. And they hit the poorest people in the world living in very tenuous accommodation below sea level in Jakarta. So these issues are hitting cities, and it's why cities are acting. Bill Clinton was affiliated with the C-40, made this comment at a speech he made in Seoul. Said cities are showing the world how. And I think, to me, one of the challenges of climate change is, particularly in the United States, where you have significant parts of your political spectrum still denying that it's caused by people, we really need to show people that when you address climate change, you actually create better places to live and you're not destroying the economy. And having President Clinton saying that was very important. So, worked with the Clinton Climate Initiative, just a little bit about the C-40. And I want to go back to the infrastructure issue, because I want to give you a sense of why it's so expensive. If you Google sewers in Toronto, this is the image you come up with. And I can't give credit to the photographer because I don't know who it was. I shamelessly took this off Google. And it gives you a sense, a sewer just isn't a little pipe like this. They can be huge, massive pieces of infrastructure. And when you have flooding that's in a city that's been set up to take the flooding into storm sewers rather than let it drain through natural processes in the soil, as you get more and more big storms, you have to completely rebuild these kinds of systems. That's why it's so expensive. One thing I learned, though, after including this slide in my presentation, is it is not in fact a sewer in Toronto. This is the Niagara Falls generating station when they were fixing it a few years ago, but I think it still makes the point adequately. And this is Toronto's sewer shed. Hands up, people have seen a sewer shed map before. Well, not even the engineers, 2. Okay, good. Usually there's 0. So just to give you a sense of, from Toronto's example, of how much infrastructure is involved in dealing with stormwater, in particular in these storms, and why it's so expensive. And this would be true in any major city that's already having to adapt to the increased severity and frequency of storms. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that if you broke down emissions internationally, urban, non-urban, it's 70 to 75% of emissions are urban. And most of those emissions in the urban areas are due to how we heat and cool our buildings, how we generate our electricity, and how we transport ourselves around the city. All of those have solutions that have been addressed by C40 cities that are capable of being adapted around the world and scaled up rapidly. Tokyo, for example, in 2007, I think, but don't quote me on that, started its own cap and trade system for commercial buildings. So it capped the amount of emissions from commercial buildings and said if you want to emit more, you've got to buy an allowance. You know, people debate whether we should have a carbon tax or cap and trade. My personal view is the carbon tax is a little bit more economically efficient, but my professional view is yes, let's just act. And that's what Tokyo showed. And Tokyo is a major, major world city. And it did this without any negative impact on its economy whatsoever. In fact, if you speak to commercial landlords who've undertaken significant energy renovations, you will discover, as they did, some very pleasant economic consequences. You know, in New York City, when it required commercial landlords to post the amount of energy they used, people at efficient buildings discovered they could charge more rent and get better clients, because the clients didn't want to pay to be in inefficient buildings. So there's a positive economic boost. Tokyo, and I believe that was, well, certainly before any significant cap and trade measures in North America. So a city really leading. Los Angeles, surprisingly, because we have this image of Los Angeles as a city that has terrible transportation problems. It does. But it's taken very significant measures about climate change, including changing the transportation of its vehicles at the port away from diesel. And I thought this was a really important regulatory step, because who lives near the port and whose children are at risk of the emissions from diesel? It's all the poorest people in Los Angeles, right? So the mayor there forced the port to change their vehicles away from diesel, I think, to natural gas. Electric would have been more ideal, but creating significant positive spin-off for health benefits from for the poorest people in his city. Melbourne just won a prize at the C40 in Paris, actually gave some prizes out. Has a very interesting program that is named here, Urban Landscapes Climate Adaptation Program. It's trying to deal with the increasing impact of storms by greening the city. And that's probably a better way, a more sustainable, long-lasting way than rebuilding infrastructure like Toronto is doing. I think Toronto could learn from Melbourne a little bit. But it also creates a much better place to live. And that's the interesting thing to me about all these climate policies in action. Either create a more prosperous city or a better place to live, or both. And Melbourne's obviously quite beautiful. Interestingly, Melbourne also stole a really good idea that Toronto had about how to insulate commercial buildings and lower their energy. We're really glad they did, because now their buildings are energy efficient like Toronto's as well. In fact, they did it better than we did. It's a partnership with the local gas company that's worked very well in Toronto. So that's a little bit about buildings. Energy generation. Seoul has decided to have a massive solar project. They call it Make Seoul a City of Sunlight. It's just starting, but it's on its way. It also won an award in Paris in December. In some cities, this is possible. Toronto, for example, owns its electric utility. And at a time when privatization is really the favored public policy tool in a lot of ways. It's a reminder that governments owning institutions actually can have policy benefits that are unanticipated and aren't just about the lowest price and most efficient running. Electricity is an interesting challenge because it's also a heavily regulated industry, and in the US it's regulated predominantly at the state level, but it does give a real opportunity for action, the fact that enough of either the regulation or the institutions are in public hands. Calgary, I don't know if you know Calgary, Canada, but it's the heart of Canada's oil patch. It's Canada's Houston. And, generally speaking, politically, Alberta tends to elect people who fight against climate change. Notwithstanding that, all of their municipal power comes from wind. So the heart of the oil patch, but they still showed significant leadership, and the municipal government did that by signing contracts to buy wind farms outside the city limits. So there are city actions that can make real change. The way a city purchases its electricity, for example, can be a tool to make change. Yellowknife in the far north is using local resources. Shenzhen, China. China is amazing when they decide to do something. So Shenzhen, and we're now on the vehicles, has decided that all of the vehicles in that city will have to be electric. All of them. Public transport, private, everything. Now imagine the mayor of New York City deciding that, and imagine what would happen in the United States of America. First thing would be a lawsuit. And you wouldn't get there. It would take you time to get there. You'd have to build the infrastructure to encourage people to use electric cars. You'd probably have to subsidize them, etc. Anyway, they've just decided. This is a third prize winner from the C-40 Awards last December. It'll be interesting to see how they succeed, but when China makes a decision like this, they generally go ahead and do it. So it'll be very likely they will. So transportation, again, one of the important things, I think, as the electricity grid becomes green, we need to think about moving more and more to electric-based transportation, including public transport. And I was very pleased. I took the train here from Newark and the Dinky over. Now, I asked the guy who was operating the Dinky if it was a pre-war train. And he had no idea what war I was talking about, I don't think. But I finally asked the question I meant to, which is, how old is this train? He said he thought it was made in the 50s. So it's sort of good ideas coming back full circle. But the more transportation, including city-based transportation, this is from Ottawa, Canada, they've traditionally been a place that's, all of the public transport was diesel buses. That's better than having automobiles. You still have lower emissions and lots of other city building benefits, but they're building electric-based LRTs to replace some of the trunk lines. And that kind of initiative is spreading all over North America, and I think very important. So to give you a sense of how this actually works and how you connect economic development, social justice, and environmental policy, I want to use the example of Toronto because I know it best and because I'm really proud of what we did. But all of the cities I'm talking about and all of the C-40 cities would have gone through a similar process. So we started with a climate change strategy in 2007. That passed City Council unanimously. And that's one of the interesting things for me. And I think one of the reasons that cities are able to act in ways that national governments sometimes can't is because individual voters actually want to live in environmentally sustainable cities. They care about green space, they care about trees, they care about parks, they care about the air they breathe. You look at the political movement that's starting in China because people can't breathe the air in Beijing. It's the first sort of free political movement, and it's coming about because of an environmental issue there. And so city governments tend to have far more license, and there seems to be less constraint from the kind of traditional sectoral lobbying that happens in national government. So, those 44 councillors, and they were all in their desks because the vote after this was to create 2 entirely new taxes that the city had never used before. And as you can imagine, that's an unusual thing to do in government. I actually ran on it in the election. I said, we're going to raise taxes and create new ones, but with that money, we're going to build a great city. and people voted for that message. Very interesting. Got almost 60% of the vote. So that was the day, and people were there. That strategy, and one of the things about climate change is there's not one thing; it's a variety of things. So that strategy addressed a whole range of things: planting trees, everything. It was linked to an economic development strategy that said, how are we going to ensure that there are jobs in Toronto, in this green city? And it was linked to a sustainable energy strategy, which we did in partnership with the electric utility, because we owned it, that shows how we're going to meet the green energy part of that, which I'll talk about more later if people are interested in the technical part of that. But it was a very interesting study, and it was real. So that's what we did. The result, greenhouse gases by 2012 were down by 15%. And by 2016, they're down by 20% in Toronto. Now, Toronto, as I said before, it's a big, economically successful city that still has some manufacturing. The heavy manufacturing tends to be outside of it, but there's still some manufacturing inside. And as a result of that plan from 2007 and the province closing a coal-fired power plant nearby, greenhouse gas emissions dropped by more than the Kyoto target. So when I read in the media that we can't do this, and even if we could, we couldn't afford to do it, I yelled at the newspaper, actually, at breakfast, and said, that's nonsense, because it is complete nonsense. If Toronto, a very thriving, economically successful city, can do it, we can do this across North America. And we actually created a city that was better to live in. So how did we do that? And how did we ensure that these economic policies, or these environmental policies, actually benefited people economically? I'll take you through 2 or 3 examples quickly, and then happy to take questions. This is a photograph of a place called Regent Park. Regent Park was one of the first post-war social housing developments in North America. And by the year 2000, the buildings had deteriorated greatly. They've become a place riddled with crime, which is not typical in Canada. You know, we're a very, very, very safe country. We have quite strict gun laws. You know, our crime levels are way less than a typical American city of our size. But Regent Park had a real safety issue, and the buildings were deteriorating as well. So we saw an opportunity to rebuild the community, and the planners had a really interesting insight. When Regent Park was built, the roads were cut off from the neighborhoods around it, and the buildings were built to face inward around little tiny parks. And those were the places unsavory elements would congregate, these little tiny parks. And it made it very unsafe for the residents. And it also created kind of a stigma, because the roads were completely cut off. So the neighborhoods around it, which were fairly low income just post-war, but had become gentrified, you know, middle-class neighborhoods where literally you couldn't go through them into the low-income neighborhood. So the planner's insight was, let's rebuild the roads so that people here aren't stigmatized and are part of the fabric of the whole community. The head of the housing company had an even more important insight. He said, the first thing we need to do is speak to the people who live there and give them a very real say over what's going to happen. So we took the planner's idea, the need to rebuild the buildings, the need to address the safety issues, went to the community and said, we're going to find the money, a couple of billion Canadian dollars, to rebuild these buildings. What would you like? Oh, and here's our insight about the roads. What would you like? First thing I said was, well, don't rebuild them. We're happy here. But, which is interesting, right? It's their neighborhood. But when shown the conditions of the buildings and they knew that they had to be rebuilt, they said, okay, what we want are a few things. First of all, we want a grocery store. You know, in common with other, people know the redlining issues, grocery stores and banks tend not to come to low-income neighborhoods, so there is a grocery store there now, Freshco's, also a bank, except we want a bank. They also want a very famous Canadian donut chain. Do people know Tim Hortons here? Yeah. But that's symbolic of being part of the middle class, right? It was a very important symbolic issue. So that was the first thing. I wanted some amenities that traditionally don't come to a low-income neighborhood. The second thing they said was, if you're going to spend $2 billion fixing our buildings, we want our children to have jobs in that process. You know, it's a low-income neighborhood for one reason. People have jobs that pay poorly. So we passed an ordinance that said that 25% of the jobs on the contracts had to be for people who lived in Regent Park, and they had to get the training. A couple other things they wanted. They said, we'd like some housing. If we get a better job, we don't want to have to move out. We'd like some housing, mixed income housing here as well. And we'd like to live in a really high standards of sustainability. So this complex got rebuilt, built around all of those principles. 25% of the jobs went to local people, young people that got trained for the jobs. It's built on district energy, so it's far more energy efficient than a typical set of buildings like this. They got their amenities. And you have the combination, because the municipal government works directly with people and listens to them, of environmental and social strategies coming together. And that's true throughout all the climate initiatives that I'm going to show. I do have to tell one quick anecdote about this, though. I had the privilege, because I was the mayor, of, I think dropping's the right phrase, dropping the first wrecking ball. It was one of those great old classic machines. You pull it up with a chain and let it go, and it knocks the wall down. Every 7-year-old boy wants this. Right? It's really fantastic. And there was this great photo on the front page of the paper, so my media people were so happy. Me in a hard hat, knocking down the wall, everybody's cheering. And I spoke to the contractor who was doing the demolition. I said, what about the local hiring requirement? And he said, you know, Mayor, when I first heard about this, I thought you were crazy, but it's actually the best thing we've ever done. Some of the kids really needed some skills training, but my employees love it, and it's fantastic. So we also created community doing that. Interestingly, that photograph was seen by the Ministry of Labour from the province of Ontario, which is the equivalent of the state government. They called the contractor and said, does David Miller have a license to drive a wrecking ball? And the job got shut down by the Ministry of Labour. So be careful about the photo ops you take, for those of you who are in, at least I didn't get prosecuted. That's the one good thing out of it. So this was, you know, part of the philosophy talk, and listen to the people, meet their needs. Another local need that helps communities like this survive is daycare. And in Toronto's case, we have authority over daycare. It's not true of all municipalities. And I'm only mentioning that because if we're going to address climate change, the policies have to be holistic. And one of the reasons city governments are being successful is because they understand issues like this that are basic issues about people being able to live in a neighborhood. And if you don't have access to good early learning opportunities for your children, and you don't know if they're going to be safe during the day, you can't find a new job, or you can't take a full-time job, you have to take a part-time job. And there's a parallel to environmental strategies. And if they're going to be successful, those kinds of implications, the implications on real people's daily lives have to be considered. And here's the young people getting their jobs. Two more quick issues, and then I'll wrap up. On my theme of how you generate electricity, how you heat and cool buildings, how you transport yourself. These are concrete slab apartment buildings built all over North America in the 50s and 60s. It was a typical technique. In Canada, they happened to be financed by the federal government because post-war there was a housing crisis. And concrete has two notable qualities. One is it's permanent. These buildings are going to be there for 100 years. They're really good buildings. The second is it has no insulating power whatsoever. So there's 1,000 of these in Toronto proper, 2,000 in the region, probably another 5,000 across Canada. Somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 buildings built with no insulating power. So a one-bedroom apartment like this here is so poorly insulated that it uses more energy to heat and cool than a small house. So there's a huge opportunity with these buildings that are all over Canada, all over North America, to insulate them from the outside and make dramatic savings in energy use and therefore greenhouse gases. And by the way, if you do it right, create local jobs for local people in the same way that we did for Regent Park, which is what's happening in Toronto. The University of Toronto estimated that if you used external insulation on these buildings and insulated all 1,000 of them, greenhouse gas emissions would be about 6% lower just from that action in the city as a whole. And you would create about 30,000 jobs, 1,000 buildings, 30 people a year to do the work. So a huge economic impact, and it pays for itself in 7 to 10 years. And a city will think that way. It will think, how are we creating local prosperity, how are we creating jobs, and how are we building a cleaner, more vibrant city to live in. So that's just the jobs again, an example. I talked about how we heat and cool our buildings and how we generate electricity. This is a project in Toronto in which, instead of using electricity to cool the downtown office towers and the government buildings in the summer, which, when this project was started, all came from coal-fired plants. As David can attest to, sometimes in the summer in Buffalo and Toronto, it gets pretty hot. It's a time of electricity consumption peaking. This project took all of those buildings off the electricity network and cooled them by using cool lake water. And the lake water at the bottom is the same temperature all year round. It's about 34 degrees. So the lake water, it comes through this pipe, it's treated at the city treatment, goes through a heat exchanger, and then heat and cools the buildings. And in emergencies, it can be used as clean water for the city because it's treated. That all paid for itself, completely economic. Think of all the places in the world that are beside a body of water that can put a pipe down instead of using fossil fuels. And it's nothing whatsoever to do with this so-called environment economy trade-off. It is environment and economy. And if we could license that technology, this company was originally owned by the city, although it was sold off a couple of years ago. If that technology could be licensed, it would create a huge moneymaker for Canada. I've been a bit slower, so I'm just going to skip over that point, but I can talk about it if you like. The final point I wanted to talk was about transportation. New York City has a fantastic transportation network. If you look at New York's greenhouse gases, 80% of them are from buildings, very little is from transportation. Toronto, 60% are from heat and cooling buildings, quite a bit from transportation, because we have a subway line, this gray line here, that's basically across. We don't have a network. And if you want people to get out of cars into transit, you need to build a network. And so in 2007, March 2007, we announced that this was our plan for a network. In June 2007, we got full funding for it from the provincial government. That's how it works in Canada. And in 2009, we started construction on Shepherd. There's been some political fights. That's on hold, but restarting this year. Finch is restarting this year, and Eglinton is well underway. And this is to create a network around the city, but one of the things it does is it also creates a network to some of the lowest income neighborhoods. And that's because of a deliberate strategy. When the network was planned, part of the analysis was, where can we welcome development under the city's official plan, bringing in jobs and growth? And also, where's the biggest transit use? And of course, the biggest transit use is in low-income neighborhoods because people take the bus. So they can't afford to drive and park at work. So by building a transportation network, this is based on light rail running in the middle of streets with one or two small subway additions. By building a transportation network, you will encourage environmental goods by getting people out of their cars onto transit, but you also encourage a social good by bringing higher order rapid transit to people who need it the most and use it the most. And it's incredibly important. I'll tell you why, and then I'll wrap up. When we were out speaking to Torontonians about this, we had about 80 public meetings about the plan. It's called Transit City. I went to meet my assistant, Clive, who lives above the E on Shepherd East, above the E on the east. That's an area called Malvern, fairly low-income community. And to give you some sense, Toronto is about 30 miles wide. It's a big city. And we got on the bus from Malvern down to Shepherd and got on the Shepherd bus, and we're handing out leaflets, which is a bit unusual. We don't expect to run into the mayor on your morning commute at 6:30 in the morning handing out leaflets. And I gave a leaflet to this woman. She said, "Mayor, what's this all about? What's a light rail?" And I said, "Well, it's like those European trams, runs down the middle of the street. They'll come every 5 minutes, very reliable, and because they're in their own right-of-way, they don't get held up by traffic like the bus, and you'll get there on time." She said, "That's great. That would really help me. Where are you going?" "Going to work." "Where do you work?" "Pearson Airport." And so Pearson Airport is off the map here to the left of the Transit City logo. It's about 30 miles away. So how do you get there? So I take the Shepherd bus, then the subway, then the Young subway, then the Finch bus, then the airport bus. How long does that take you? So if I make my connections, it's 2 hours. So you got a long day, so that's my morning job. In the afternoon, she was a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel, which is there. So she would take bus, subway, and then to get home, subway, bus. Probably 4 hours, maybe more. Now, if you think about that person, she's not home for dinner to take care of her family. She's not able to go get some kind of supplementary education to improve her skills to get one full-time job. And most importantly, in some ways, she's not able to take part in the local democratic debates about public transit to say, build this now, I need it desperately. So by doing the right thing for the environment, and this started from an environmental initiative, what you're actually doing is building places that are more socially inclusive, more socially just, more economically efficient, because the building of this creates huge potential employment, huge potential for development. In fact, you're creating a far better city. And that's why cities are acting. They're acting because they need to, and they're acting because it's the right thing to do, while nations are still talking. I've been much longer than I meant to, but there's still some time for questions. Thanks very much.
Questions for David Miller? Yes.
What is the relationship between Toronto City and its suburbs when you're dealing with these environmental issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Toronto is a region of about 6 million people. The city itself is just under 3. The way it's governed is the immediate suburbs are grouped into regional governments. Toronto used to be a regional government with cities inside it. They were amalgamated in 1997. So Toronto is kind of the big fish now. There is no formal structure of collaboration on these issues. On issues like public transit, environmental issues, water infrastructure, there's a long-standing history of collaborative work because they obviously impact each other. So there is voluntary collaboration, and it's been good historically. For example, Toronto, well, I won't go back to the sewer shed, but if you looked at it, the water lines actually go north to the suburbs, so they rely on our water. It's not a bad bargaining chip if you had to use it. But, so there are informal structures of collaboration. From time to time, there have been formal structures of collaboration, kind of quasi-governments. They all collapsed because the regions didn't want to talk about planning. But on issues of transport and water and parks and sewers, those kinds of things, there's very good informal collaboration. It's simply informal. It depends on goodwill. But because the civil servants in Canada are permanent, there's a long history of collaboration at the civil service level, and that keeps it going if you have a politician who isn't as cooperative. I don't know if that helps, but yes.
A couple of questions. The examples that you gave, this is really inspiring. In terms of Shenzhen, for example, trying to move toward a fully electrified vehicle and transportation, right? It's not helpful is that all the electricity is coming from coal-fired power plants. So when those decisions are being made, are they thinking about the entire energy ecosystem when they make a decision like that?
China's funny, in my experience, and I don't pretend to be an expert, but I've had some experience. At the same time they're pushing the building of coal-fired plants, they are pushing very strongly, particularly on solar, to have clean energy, and I believe Shenzhen is one of the cities that's supposed to go all clean.
Okay. So they're thinking, I mean, that's what you have to do. If you're going to make a statement that you're going to go fully electric vehicle, it's not useful unless you're also, trying to decarbonize the electricity source.
I agree with you completely. In fact, that's one of Ontario's successes, is our electricity grid is significantly decarbonized, not completely. Quebec's is pretty complete, and so is BC from even 10 years ago. But I believe from your colleagues' nods that Shenzhen is one of the cities that's going to go.
Yeah, but so okay, I'm going to segue off of that point, which is that You also gave the example, I guess it was Calgary that is now getting all of its
Yep.
electricity, you said, from wind, but
Yep.
how is that possible? What's the backup?
It's essentially an offset. They buy as much electricity as they use from wind.
Okay, but the sources, of course, there's an amalgamation of different sources because you have to have base load.
Oh, sure, but Calgary's politically important. Maybe in hindsight I should use a different example here, but in Canadian context it's extremely politically important because all of the major Canadian oil companies are headquartered in Calgary. So the fact that they're able to do this creates a political dynamic that really matters. Alberta's energy grid is really dirty. It's very coal oriented, and the government just announced a phase out of coal, but it's going to take a long time because they're private and they have to honor the contracts. In Ontario, they're publicly owned, so they're going to shut it down. And yes, I agree with your point completely. It's you know.
Okay, can I say one more thing? I don't mean to monopolize, but I'm just...
You're the dean.
No, not yet.
In that case, no.
Just one more question. What is going to happen? What is your view of the future of the tar sands industry in Canada? Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah.
Given what's happened in terms of the revolution in hydrofracking and horizontal drilling that's allowed new sources of oil to come on.
Mining bitumen is only economic when the price of a barrel of oil is around $100. So it's going to be in a slow decline unless oil prices go back up. My uneducated, complete guess is that what we'll see is it's sort of going along the way it is right now with not the rapid expansion that was envisioned and pushed by the Harper government, which is what environmentalists were pushing back about with the pipelines. It's a very dicey political issue in Canada, but that's my guess.
So it'll still limp along.
Yes, they are, to be fair. Alberta is, they've brought into place a carbon tax and they're pursuing some real measures to try and deal with the emissions. They've got a progressive government now, it's the NDP, which are democratic socialists, which you actually don't have to apologize for saying in Canada. So there's some real prospect there that they're going to try and argue that they've dealt with the emissions and they may actually make some progress. Yep.
Your picture of a grocery store reminded me of some just lived in 3 cities that people in cities eat food. They don't get it from those cities. Like, is there any thinking in the C-PREE group about agriculture, given that they bust it all in, or some all get it from other areas?
There's somewhat, yes is the answer, but not as well thought out. Buildings, generating electricity, and transportation, we know inside and out, are making huge progress because they make great cities. Food, there's different pilots. There's efforts to grow food inside cities, including there's one in Brooklyn, isn't there? On a roof?
Yes.
Yes.
It's a Whole Foods roof.
Yeah, and there's
They're going to get that.
a lot of, philosophically, a lot of mayors believe in things like the 100-mile diet and that sort of thing, are trying to build bridges with farming communities immediately outside the cities, but I don't think it's nearly as far along as the things I was talking about.
I think we will have to end the questions now to let folks out at 1 o'clock, but I know that David Miller will probably be available for a few minutes here. And I want to thank the Honorable David Miller for a very...
Oh, thank you.
Schedule.